Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit extraneous material into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, gun violence is the leading cause of death for American children. Let me repeat that. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for our kids. It is shameful that every member in this body knows that guns are used to kill our kids, and the Republican majority is refusing to take any action to stop this epidemic. Parents are scared to send their kids to school. They're worried that it may be the last time they see them alive. Kids are being impacted by active shooter drills and are scared to death that their school will be the next site of a school shooting. The Gun Violence Prevention Task Force is leading efforts in Congress to compel our Republican colleagues to bring gun violence prevention measures up for a vote. The American people are with us on this. The only place that gun violence prevention is a partisan issue is right here in this Congress. A recent Fox News poll shows that the American people overwhelmingly support gun violence prevention measures. 87% support universal background checks. 81% support raising the legal age to purchase firearms to 21. 80% support red flag laws. And in this same Fox poll, 61% support banning assault weapons. It's time for the House Republicans to join House Democrats in prioritizing saving our kids. Democrats took an important first step in the last Congress when President Biden signed into law the Bipartisan Safer Community Act, which was the first major gun violence prevention bill signed in 30 years. There's still more work to do. We're here this evening to shine a spotlight on the failure of the Republicans to join us in support of policies that will save lives. The Republican leadership's callous inaction is contributing to a mass casualty every day in our country. There have been more mass shootings this year than there has been days in the year. As a combat veteran, a hunter, and a gun owner, not one Republican can tell me that background checks interfere with our Second Amendment. When debating background checks, we have definitively refuted every tired Republican excuse time and time again. Republicans have countered with an even more callous response. They respond to every death with deafening silence. The Gun Violence Prevention Task Force will continue our work to hold Republicans accountable for their obstruction. The leading cause of death of our children and teens demands our attention, and we're demanding that the House pass legislation to help save lives. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague from Colorado, Mr. Crow, an Army Ranger who deployed in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the victims of the horrific mass shooting that occurred at Century 16 Movie Theater in Aurora, Colorado 11 years ago. My community forever changed the night of July 20th, 2012. 12 people with arms full of popcorn and candy walked into Theater 9 and never walked out. I think those of us in this room whose communities have faced this type of tragedy would agree there's a before and there's an after. And what comes after is a shattered community trying to make sense of a senseless act of violence. Today we remember Veronica, AJ, Michaela, Jessica, Alexander, Jonathan, John, Matt, Alex, Jesse, Rebecca, and Gordon. They should still be here. Every year, Aurora and the greater Colorado community come together to remember the lives we lost and the collective trauma shared. We also recognize those who, in the face of unspeakable fear, stepped up to help their loved ones and neighbors. Let us not grow numb to the pain of this day. Rather, we honor the lives of those we lost by being relentless in our pursuit for gun reform. As members of Congress and as Americans, it is our duty.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and great representative from the state of Pennsylvania, Mary Gay Scanlon.
Thank you. There have been more mass shootings this year than there have been days. We do not have to live like this. Children are scared to go to school, parents are scared to put their kids on the bus, and teachers are scared that they'll have to protect their students from a mass shooter in the classroom. And the daily gun violence that often goes unreported by the media, including suicide and domestic violence, impacts neighborhoods in every corner of the country. We do not have to live like this. Last Congress, House Democrats passed into law the most significant gun violence prevention legislation in 30 years, but we know that was only a baby step in the right direction. We have seen that evidence-based violence prevention programs like group violence intervention can dramatically reduce gun violence. When it was implemented in the city of Chester, Pennsylvania 3 years ago, homicides by gun dropped by over 60%. And the expansion of that program to other cities around the country is already yielding results. But we've also seen the fatal impact of guns flooding our streets nationwide and making their way into the hands of criminal or mentally unstable users. We can't give up. Democrats are working to prevent the bloodshed. We're offering common sense legislation that will address the epidemic of gun violence and protect the Second Amendment rights of responsible gun owners. Democrats introduced 3 discharge petitions last month to ban assault weapons, require universal background checks, and close the Charleston loophole. The MAGA Republicans running Congress don't want these bills to come to the floor because they would have to make a choice, and voters would see it, whether to side with the gun lobby that funds their campaigns, or to protect our kids and our communities. I urge my colleagues, especially those who claim to be moderates, to have the courage to sign the discharge petitions and force Speaker McCarthy to bring the legislation to the floor, and to have the courage to choose kids over guns. We do not have to live this way. I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to remind you, Mr. Speaker, that guns are the leading cause of death for children in the United States of America. And we're here today because we can do something about it. If you look at this other chart, it clearly points out that, again, firearms are the leading cause of death. But if you look at other factors, the second, motor vehicle accidents, look at the steep decline in the loss of lives from motor vehicle accidents. It's because we did something. We passed laws. We made cars safer. We reduced the number of children who were killed in automobile accidents by taking action on this floor. And it is shameful that that the Republican leadership will not allow us to do that today to curb children's death by gun violence. It's my honor to recognize next the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Congressman Jake Auchincloss. 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding and for convening this critically important special order hour. I rise today to address the plague of gun violence in our country. I was asked recently whether January 6, 2021 was my worst day in Congress, and I answered truthfully that no, it wasn't, actually. My worst day in Congress was the night of the Uvalde shooting, when I tucked my children into bed, knowing that families in Texas would never get to do the same again, when at that very moment they were identifying them by their shoes. I am sad to say that since then, my Republican colleagues have continued to bow to the will of the gun lobby, instead of listening to families across the country who are begging for action. This uniquely American suffering is a policy choice. It doesn't have to be this way. We know what we need to do to fix it. We need to pass the assault weapons ban. I slept, ate, trained, and patrolled with an assault weapon for 4 years as a Marine officer. Weapons of war have no place on our streets or near our schools. We need also to adopt common sense gun safety measures like universal background checks, red flag laws, safe storage requirements, and evidence-driven violence intervention policies. All of these are supported by a supermajority of Americans and, indeed, by a majority of gun owners. My home state of Massachusetts is a good example of how strong, sound policy can save lives. Research suggests that if our state's gun safety legislation were adopted nationwide, tens of thousands of children could be saved every year. Congress would do well to follow that lead. It's time for Republicans in Congress to find a backbone to stand up to the gun lobby and the NRA and to work with Democrats to keep our communities safe. We cannot continue to allow our schools, our places of worship, our grocery stores to become scenes of terror because of a lack of political courage. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, could you give us any idea when the Republican leadership will bring bills to deal with gun violence prevention to the floor for a vote? I didn't think so. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Congresswoman Hillary Slotkin.
Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the West Michiganders who are asking, begging Congress to finally act on the uniquely American gun violence epidemic. As a mother and a lawmaker, I simply cannot sit by and let our kids be senselessly killed in their classrooms and our communities any longer. It's just too much. Gun violence has become the #1 cause of death for kids in the United States. Not drug overdoses, not car accidents, gun violence. Earlier this year, the entire state of Michigan watched in horror as Michigan State University campus was on lockdown during a mass shooting. 3 students died and 5 were injured. The reverberating impacts were felt around the entire state and the entire country. The effects of this trauma linger. This is now the reality for our children and young adults, but it doesn't have to be. I stand here on the floor today with my sons watching on, urging my Republican colleagues to take common sense action. We can and must come together to close loopholes in the law, ensure universal background checks, and keep hands out of those who should not have them. I stand ready with my fellow task force members to do the work to protect our kids, schools, families, and communities across the country. It's time our Republican colleagues joined us. I yield back.
I'd like to yield now to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Congresswoman Valerie Fauci.
Thank you for your leadership. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge Congress to confront and act on the deadly epidemic that plagues our communities each day, gun violence. This is a painful topic and one that's near to my heart. In this year alone, there's been an average of 2 mass shootings per day, and gun violence continues to be the leading cause of death for children and teens in this country. Earlier this month, a 5-year-old girl from my district was shot and killed by one of her family members after an argument, and the girl's 15-year-old babysitter was also shot 7 times. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated event. In Durham, which is located in my district, over 20 young people under the age of 17 have been a victim of gun violence since the start of this year. Thoughts and prayers are not enough and will never be enough. Gun violence victims, gun violence survivors, their families, and their loved ones all deserve more. And Congress must act urgently to save lives and keep our communities safe. The House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force has been pushing for action by signing discharge petitions for the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, the assault weapons ban, and to block the Charleston loophole. This is a bipartisan issue that a majority of Americans support, but we need support from across the aisle. Addressing gun violence requires an all-hands-on-deck approach that includes increasing access to mental health services, investing in youth mentoring programs, decreasing firearms access through safe storage, and much more. And my Republican colleagues claim to be working on this issue, but not one of them has joined our task force to help end gun violence nationwide, and instead they have unilaterally worked against gun violence prevention action on this House floor. No one in America should have to fear for their lives in their schools, our stores, our places of worship, our streets, or anywhere in our communities. House Democrats and the House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force stand united, and we will not waver. I encourage our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to put their words into action and join us in these efforts to save lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The gentlelady mentioned that our Republican colleagues aren't doing anything in regard to guns. And it's actually worse than that. They have done something. The Republicans passed a bill, a gun bill, off this floor this year. Their bill would make this gun legal. Short-barreled rifles have been regulated by the National Firearms Act for decades. They're regulated because they are incredibly dangerous, they're easy to conceal, and they are deadly accurate. They are used in crimes, they're responsible for the deaths of many, many people, and they've been tightly regulated. The Republicans in this House passed a bill that makes this gun legal. They call it an arm brace. Arm brace is just another way of saying you're putting a stock on a semi-automatic assault pistol. So you're making it a short-barreled assault rifle. It is lethal, it is immoral, and everyone who voted for that bill and the leadership that brought it to this floor for a vote should be ashamed of themselves. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Thank you. I really appreciate the leadership and just guidance by Congressman Thompson as he leads our effort with the task force. I've learned so much about some of the work that's been done prior to getting here, and knowing, again, we're taking steps, but we know that we need to move with urgency. I know 205 of my Democratic colleagues have signed a discharge petition to bring assault weapons ban to the House floor for a vote. But I don't know how many more mass shootings will it take for Republicans to finally join us. These weapons of war have been used in many of the deadliest mass shootings in our history and are weapons of choice for shooters looking to kill as many people as possible and as quickly as possible. From 1994, Mr. Speaker, to 2004, while American families were protected by the assault weapons ban, there were 40% fewer shootings. But since the ban expired in 2004, gun violence has massacred our communities. A bullet fired by an assault weapon can tear a softball-sized wound into victims. Imagine a child. There is no reason that anyone needs a weapon that can fire up to 60 rounds per minute. Weapons of war designed to hunt human beings have no place in our communities, our schools, our places of worship, and on our streets. It is shameful that many Republican colleagues care more about securing funding from the NRA than saving the lives of our children. The inaction has left our communities devastated and families torn apart. The trauma of being survivors of gun violence is real. We cannot afford to wait any longer. We owe it to the victims, to survivors, to our children. We must honor them with action by banning assault weapons. Maddie, who's one of the 10-year-old child that was killed in Uvalde, she deserves us to act today. She deserves us to do more to save lives. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman has 40 minutes remaining.
How many?
40.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 30 people every day are killed by someone using a gun. If you add accidental deaths and suicides, that number jumps up to 100 people per day. It costs the American taxpayers roughly $600 billion every year. Gun violence costs almost $600 billion every year. Communities across our country are upended. We already heard that there have been more mass shootings this year than there has been days of the year. Police officers across the country are taking ghost guns off the street every single day. Guns that can be purchased as a kit so they don't need to need a background check, and they're unserialized. These are guns that are used a lot in crime. Cops are taking them off the street every day. This is a serious problem. Our communities are hurting. People are being killed. We need to take action. The Republican leadership in this House needs to bring gun violence prevention legislation to the floor so we can vote it out and help keep our communities safer. Now I'll yield to the gentleman from California, Congressman Mark DeSallier.
I want to thank my neighbor and colleague and friend, Congressman Thompson, for the time and for your tireless leadership on this important topic and your incredible understanding from many perspectives on this important subject. I come to this subject as a survivor of gun violence, having lost my father to gun violence 44 years ago. As Mr. Thompson mentioned, suicide is a leading issue with gun violence, and we know the free and easy access to guns in states and communities that don't provide for evidence-based research results in almost 60% of those daily deaths, 60 of the 100 a day, are by people that are self-inflicted, like my father. As we know, in California, in the district I represent, and the districts we represent in the Bay Area, Mr. Thompson, we can be proud that these common sense, evidence-based gun violence and public health initiatives make you safer. According to Gifford, significantly safer. And we have years of research to demonstrate this. While we're proud of the fact that you're safer in California and in our districts because of sound public evidence and constitutionally approved policy, we are frustrated that weak gun laws in other parts of the country make it more dangerous even in our communities. 40% of the guns used in California come from outside of the state illegally. The ATF reports that nearly 60,000 guns are trafficked across state lines nationally each year with tragic results. As many as 87% of the firearms used in crime in Chicago, New York, and Boston were trafficked from other states in spite of those jurisdictions' thoughtful gun violence prevention laws. 75% of traced guns that cross state lines come from states without background checks. Because of this patchwork of state and local laws, states like California with strong gun laws see increased rates of gun homicide and gun crime when they border states with weak gun laws. To make a real impact, action has to happen here at the federal level. We should all commit that we will not back down from this fight because every American, no matter where they live, regardless of where they call home, deserves to live free of the fear of gun violence. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd like to yield now to the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Brad Snyder.
Thank you, and Mr. Speaker, thank you for letting me have this moment to speak today. I rise to once again call for urgent action to address the epidemic of gun violence in our nation. What is wrong with us as a people that we are increasingly here in this well mourning needless gun deaths? Yet we can't, in this body, move any common sense, wildly popular policies to keep our children and our communities safe. How many more shootings will we have to endure, and how many more lives will have to be lost before Congress, and let me be specific here, before my Republican colleagues will do anything to help take care of our kids and our communities? We have put to this Congress legislation to require universal background checks, to ban assault weapons, get ghost guns off our streets, and store firearms safely. And yet not one of my Republican colleagues can find the will or the courage to support any of this life-saving legislation. For goodness sake, these bills are law and order legislation. Every day, more than 100 people die from gun violence in this country. In the first 6 months of this year alone, more than 23,000 people have lost their lives needlessly to gun violence in the United States. I represent Highland Park, Illinois, that is still reeling from a mass shooting last July 4th, where 7 people were murdered and more than 40 were grievously wounded. Last year, that was the 308th mass shooting in the country. This year, we've already had more than 390 mass shootings. These deaths impact us all. The trauma resonates through our society. Right now in America, our children enter kindergarten, and one of the first things they will learn is how to react and behave if an active shooter enters their school. As has been noted, gun violence is the leading cause of death for children in the United States. As it says right there on the board, guns are the leading cause of death for children in the United States. Children are suffering post-traumatic stress from Highland Park in my communities and in communities all around this nation. Children facing violence every single day as they walk to school, as they study in their class, as they join their families in houses of worship. Republican inaction is unconscionable. As I spend my time in my district talking to constituents, I constantly hear about how Congress needs to tackle this issue. Earlier this month, I held a roundtable with police chiefs in our community. 17 communities, police chiefs, plus our county sheriff. The very first issue they raised with me, which was brought up earlier by Mr. Thompson, the very first issue they raised was getting guns off our streets, ghost guns off our streets. And for those who are unfamiliar, again, ghost guns are unserialized and untraceable firearms that can be bought online and assembled at home. Bought online by criminals, bought online by young kids who are too young to buy guns in a store. I am proud today to be introducing the Ghost Guns and Untraceable Firearms Act with my colleague and friend, Representative Adriano Espaillat. Our legislation would amend the legal definition of a firearm to include ghost guns, requiring those that buy gun components to comply with federal gun regulation. I urge leadership to bring this and other critical common sense gun violence prevention bills to the floor immediately. This is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This issue affects every American, in every community, in every state of our nation. And we have to do our jobs in this body to keep our communities and our children safe. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks. Mr. Speaker, tonight members of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force have made clear the terrible cost of gun violence on our kids, our families, schools, and our communities. We've talked about sad milestones. In 2020, guns became the leading killer of kids in America after overtaking motor vehicle accidents. Another dark milestone has been the 389 mass shootings already this year. We've had more mass shootings by mid-July this year than we had in all of 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. We know it doesn't have to be this way. We know that states with the most gun violence prevention laws have half the death rate for children and teenagers compared to states with the least gun violence prevention laws. But the states can't do it alone. This weak national gun safety laws, it is much too easy for people who are a danger to themselves or a danger to others to access guns regardless of where they live. According to the ATF's gun tracing database, the largest source of out-of-state guns used in crimes in my home state, California, is from Arizona, a state with over twice the gun death rate and whose gun laws are rated an F. Likewise, New York, a state with the fourth lowest gun death rate, has guns pouring in from Georgia, which you might have guessed has an F rating as well for their weak gun violence laws and over 3 times the gun death rate. Similarly, gun deaths in Illinois are fueled by guns from Indiana, Missouri, and Wisconsin, states whose gun laws are rated F, F, and D+, respectively. Members of our task force have been calling on the Republican leadership to bring common sense gun violence prevention bills to the floor to protect our kids and keep our communities safe. Mr. Speaker, tonight we've been on the floor for 30 minutes focused on gun violence prevention. That's 30 more minutes than Republicans have scheduled to debate gun violence prevention bills on the House floor this entire Congress. Tonight, you heard from Army veterans, Marine Corps veterans, combat veterans, from hunters, from gun owners, from moms, and from dads. We say enough. We need to pass laws that will help keep our children and our communities safe. And we'll continue to fight until Republicans join us in stopping the gun violence epidemic or until Democratic leadership in the next Congress can resume our work and pass the gun violence prevention legislation that has proven to save lives. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
I thank the chairman very much, and I want to join the stellar members of so many different backgrounds to add an extra 2 minutes to that 30 minutes and emphasize that it is now 32 more minutes than we have had an opportunity to discuss gun violence against our children. I'm reminded of the late John Lewis, and as I look to the front, Ms. Speaker, where you are, I'm reminded of the overwhelming impact that gun violence had just a couple of years ago when he was alive, so much so that members took to the floor, the actual floor, sat down on the floor because the pain was so deep. I remember the tear that President Obama shed as he had to speak about Sandy Hook. And I remember my going to Uvalde within days of 19 children and teachers being slaughtered. Yes, Mr. Speaker, they were slaughtered with an AR-15 that a young man was able to get online, shipped to him without any background check of sorts, without any supervision, and he was able to recklessly shoot his grandmother in the face and then leave his house to go to an elementary school just a few blocks away. One could not expect law enforcement initially to know what was going to happen. But the one thing we do know, that if that young man had not had an AR-15, those little babies in Uvalde, where parents are still in such abject pain, would still be alive. We also know that as I worship with them, as I hug them, that they have now become, through their own advocacy, absolutely incredulous that we in this country have not been able to pass bans on assault weapons, bills like the Kimberly Vaughn Firearm Safe Storage Act, which impacted Kimberly Vaughn, 14 years old, who died in the Santa Fe, because another young man was able to loosely get guns that were left at home. So I think I'm here as a mother and as a member of Congress who have been here since Columbine. And I remember being on the Columbine task force to see what we could do about guns, and then been through Sandy Hook, Parkland, Santa Fe, Texas, Virginia Tech, the various churches, synagogues, temples that we've seen gun violence, dance studios. And so I don't know what it takes for this Congress to come together. No one is trying to take away anyone's firearm. Second Amendment is constitutionally present. It is in place. But none of the language in the Second Amendment prevents us from having reasonable, safe regulatory scheme that help save all of our lives. So I want to thank the chairman very much as the vice chair of the Gun Task Force and the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime. We are waiting and ready to take up bills, as we did with the Protect Our Kids and certainly Safer Communities. But there is still the lapse of real bills that further need to be in place to change laws. And the waiting period, the issue of the universal background check, storage bills are really crucial to saving lives. My last point that I want to make is that we use often mental illness. Let me say that we pray for people who suffer from mental health concerns. But other countries around the world have people who suffer from mental health concerns. I do not label them in generality. These are human beings who fight every day to survive. That is not a good excuse for saying that's what's causing gun violence. It is not. And in tribute to my colleagues who come from cities like Chicago and other cities where there's handgun violence and individual violence and domestic violence, you need to have a response to just plain gun violence. And that means we have to debate on this floor and find a common solution. My word to my colleagues, in the name of the children who have died, the number one killer of our children in America, in the name of places like Uvalde and Sandy Hook that comes to mind, Parkland and other places where children have died, we can minimally do something to help our children. Let's do real anti-gun violence legislation. Let's make our children safe. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman for her remarks and her good work on gun violence prevention efforts and her dedication to making sure that we pass the laws that will keep our kids and our communities safe. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, we've had Army combat veterans, Marine Corps combat veterans, hunters, gun owners, gun collectors, moms and dads on this floor tonight asking, pleading with the Republican leadership to allow gun violence prevention legislation to come to this floor for debate and for a vote. Mr. Speaker, can you give us any idea when your leadership will be bringing gun violence prevention bills to the floor for action? Sadly, that's what I was afraid. Silence. Just like after every mass shooting, silence. There has to be an effort on the part of this leadership to deal with this issue that's disrupting communities and leading to thousands and thousands of deaths. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.